Okay, for the next couple minutes, I want you to listen. Okay, so um, in my traditional classroom, listening or the listening exercise is a little easier, I should say. So the listening exercise is something that I think is very embodied, and I don't know that this will be as effective as I hope it would be. I know there's an urge to just get through your classes and to be done with it. I don't have a captive audience. I know perhaps some of you fast forward through the um, listening exercise, which might seem tedious, it might seem boring. If anybody took me up on the offer to watch Mana Kamana, it might seem like an equally boring proposition to sit and just listen. That's that's um, that's listening. Listening is not exciting. It takes a long time to reach somewhere if you're not motivated or if the motivations haven't been clearly spelled out. Um, it brings back a story to me from one of my ex-girlfriends, which was like a super zinger. This was the end of our relationship, and we were going through it, and uh, I was just done with undergrad, and she said something to me like, I'm gonna butcher it, I'm gonna misquote it, but she said, "Your communication, your major is communication, and you're so terrible at listening." And I thought how profound of a statement that was. And I always hold on to this because um, it wasn't until later that I fashioned myself more as a holist when it comes to communication. So there's two kind of approaches to uh, any kind of study. So communication studies being one. There's atomism, which is what we typically do in communication. If we want to study the breakdown of communication and maybe understand why somebody wasn't receiving the message, we might look at maybe environmental noise, we might look at psychological noise, we might pinpoint the listener as being the cause of this, and we might look at all the factors that interfered in the person listening. Seldom do we open it up and expand it beyond that. Communication is a holistic process, right? Your experiences with that type of communication or that particular communicator are bound to shape how you listen. So if this were my sixth job working in a sandwich shop, okay, and when I was young, I had a period of time when I first got into college when I was about 18 that I bounced around from job to job to job to job. I went from a pizza shop to Quiznos to Whole Foods to another sandwich shop where I ultimately ended up staying for the majority of my college life. And if I weren't listening or I weren't communicating correctly, it might be because I had already written off the information that I was receiving because, man, I've worked in many kitchens before. I don't need to know how to use sanitizer tablets or whatever you're trying to teach me. When we study communication from an atomistic perspective, we're looking and we're boxing something out. Okay, so you might understand the terms holism, right, or holistic medicine, much better. So let's frame this from a holistic medicine perspective. Holistic medicine seeks to treat the entire body, right? Um, when we want to treat um, a headache, when I was young, I was taught take an Advil. As I got older, I was taught maybe you should be continuously drinking water and to stay up on your hydration. Now, for something like I was at the beach yesterday with my daughter, and I just kept thinking about hydration and all the places that my daughter can, achieve some kind of hydration from the food she ate and from the water she was drinking. I began to think about this more in a holistic sense, right? That there's much more going on here than just the headache, right? Um, so, studying communication or understanding communication from a holistic perspective as opposed to an atomistic perspective. So if I were just to look at the headache and the head as being only connected to the head, okay? If I were to just look at that, that would be an atomistic approach to understanding, pain and the headache, right? The holistic approach would be to take in the entirety of the body and how the body experiences that. So, with that being said, I want to go back to the audio that you just listened. I view listening as a holistic process, part of the communication process. I don't think we can divorce it. I don't necessarily agree. I have had a hard time finding a textbook that speaks to the way that I understand communication. That it's much more. It's environmental, right? All of the factors that weigh in on communication must be considered if we are to truly understand communication. So, going back to that video, let me explain how I composed it. So that was my composition. That was something that I created. So to the average listener, if you were just listening, it might sound like an average city experience. That was recorded in Ottawa at the end of the summer of 2017. That's 6 different walks along the same path, spanning the course anywhere from 30 minutes to like 40 minutes. So it's quite the stretch. That audio is just a short clip for you. But what I did was I layered all of those recordings on top of one another and synced them up using starting points. So at a certain point, I would keep track of this is where the Chinatown gate was. This is where I made a left on this street. This is where the gas station was. This is when I walked into the park. This is when I descended the stairs towards the memorial space. I kept time markers, to help me edit what was going on in the audio. And I composed it. Okay, so I faded up and faded down audio sounds. So to some, it might sound like a cacophony, right? But this was this was compressed time. This was not only the time that it took to record, but I compressed the time over the course of a matter of weeks while I was up in Ottawa, the sounds that were around me when I was doing my research. And when it's all paired together, it does create this cacophonous sound, right? And I play this for you. Typically, what I do is I have the students do a deep listening exercise. So earlier, I don't know when you got around to watching it, I shared with you a lecture from Pauline Oliveros, who one of my dissertation committee members was the director of the Deep Listening Center. And up until very recently, I think she just left her job at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She took over all of the operations when Pauline Oliveros passed away. I was a student up there, and I had the great fortune of, sharing the same spaces with Pauline. I got to see her students do some really cool performances, making instruments for the deaf community. One of the things that she tries to get at in her work is that sound or listening can be a generative process. It can be a creative process. So the activity that we do is I have all my students, close their eyes, put their heads down, and we go through a series of instructions. And if you listen close enough, the noises that are made through this, and when you listen to it using these instructions, it becomes a symphony of just noise. And that's what I was trying to get at here. So sound does not have to be, or I should say, listening doesn't just have to be a kind of one-way thing where information is input. I think about it, disconfigure it and put it back together and make sense of it. It can be generative. Okay, by that I mean that the sheer act of listening can generate more than is actually there. So in the TED Talk, when Pauline Oliveros talks about the use of artists working together with urban planners to create beautiful sounds, I mean, I can almost imagine, in all of our various fields, how we might use urban planning to understand the types of sounds that go on throughout the day, right? So if it's a church or if it's a schoolyard, I can imagine pairing these places, strategically, not only for their, walkability, not only so they can be close to where people live, but also the sounds that come from these places can be quite beautiful, right? Thinking about how we make our cities so that we do keep the maybe the not so pleasant sounds away from where we live. So, I live very close to 46. I don't know that it's so pleasant to, to me, it's very quiet compared to where I used to live. I used to live on a very busy road when I was up in Troy, and I could hear, cops and fire trucks going all day long up and down there. So I feel fortunate to live in such a quiet area. But being so close to a busy road at times, um, it seems perhaps it seems like there was a lack of foresight when planning something of this nature. And when you stop and you listen and you really, really listen to what's going on around us, um, I can imagine something better. I can imagine, I wouldn't, move the road, right? Or move our houses, but I can imagine some type of particular planning where, we have school zones, right? Now, typically those school zones slow down for safety reasons, but what if there were we had sleep zones, right? I'm just, some of you probably sitting there, this crazy guy talking about. I'm just, pontificating here. I'm just, what if we had sleep zones and the speed limit went way down, okay, in some of these residential areas or these residential adjacent areas on major thoroughfares like 46, right, where cars had to slow down to a crawl, so we didn't have this cacophony of noise, right? Um, I think there is a lot to think about when we think through generative listening, um, and how some of the um, ideas that we could come to a conclusion on, or we can come together to create, um, happen without us even saying anything. A brainstorming session doesn't necessarily have to be you saying anything. It could just be you listening, right? Um, I'm thinking of a session where we have people coming and tasting, doing a product tasting or something. I used to go to this mall when I was a teenager, and I always thought it was so cool that they had these people walking around with clipboards, and they were doing product testing, right? They were doing customer sentiment analysis or whatever. I can't remember what it's called, but they would have people taste things. They would have people watch things and give their opinions on them. Um, they were listening, and that's all they were doing, and they were putting that together and seeing what it became. And the act of listening can be powerful. So I don't want to bore you to death here. I just wanted to share maybe a different perspective on listening, that listening doesn't always have to be this really dry, boring stuff. It could be creative. That if you stop and you pay attention for a second, that listening can be something beautiful. So what I would like you to do is I would like you, after you stop this video, I want you to just this is an exercise that I really enjoy. I want you to imagine that you could create any kind of music in the world. Okay, anything. I don't, your skill level doesn't matter. You don't have to be a composer. You don't have to be, anything. Okay, and this is, again, this is one exercise I can do from Pauline Oliveros's book. Um, she has a book called of listening practices called Deep Listening, and this is where this exercise comes from. Imagine there's no limitations. So, for example, you might say, I want to write a piece of music and have Beethoven play the keys and have Jimi Hendrix play the guitar and have Tupac, rap the vocals. There's no limits, okay? There's no time limits. There's no, money limits. There's no skill limits, okay? What would you do? Okay, what would you do? I would fill an auditorium with 1,000,000 voices and have them sing, the song that I wrote or whatever, the chorus piece that I wrote. An auditorium that fits 1,000,000 people is unthinkable. Okay, but that's the kind of thing I want you to think about. So be creative. What would you do if there were no limitations, no physical, no material, no restrictions on your composition? That's the first part. That's part one. Okay. Part two. Okay. How would you make that happen? Considering there are limitations. Okay. So knowing that there are, physical limitations, you can't get Beethoven to play it. How would you do that? Knowing there are monetary and material limitations, right? Knowing that you don't have all the money in the world to hire Kanye West to make a beat, how would you make, a song with, Mac Miller and Mac Lethal or whatever, okay? I want you to be realistic. How could you do this as you, the human being that you are? Okay, so part one, be wild and think wild. Fantasize. Part two, imagine all the limitations and restrictions exist in the world. I want you to create. Okay? Create using your imagination. How would you do this with the amount of money you have in your wallet? How would you do this with the people that you know? How would you do this given the fact that you can't bring, Notorious B.I.G. back from the dead, right? How would you do this? So that's it. That's your second part. Answer that one question, those two parts, and that's it for the listening discussion. Thank you.